professor of history at Lakehead University, was someone who left me some instructions for his memorial service about this thick. It was an entire autobiography that he left me behind with the note, "You don't need to use it all." So I mined it for the best parts, and I kept the rest for my own reference. And one day they'll find themselves tucked away in some archive or another as a testimony to a man that was spirited and energetic, insightful and wise, argumentative and sometimes even difficult, but someone whose life changed mine. As it happens, the archives at the University of Manitoba holds 529 eulogies for members and friends of this congregation that were delivered by Reverend Philip Peterson during his long tenure as minister. For most of those individuals, their eulogies provide the longest biographical narrative that was ever written about them, recording details of their lives and perceptions of their character. When I have spoken about some of the former members of this congregation, weaving their lives into the history of this community, I have done so based on what Phil wrote about them at the end of their lives. It is a treasured record, a record available to relatively few people, as it turns out. I recently stumbled upon a 3-part series about those who settled in the Husavik district south of Gimli during the last quarter of the 19th century. Written in 1946 by a newspaper editor who had grown up in the district, G.J. Olason, the grandfather of former Free Press columnist Tom Olason. The articles offered his impressions of my great-grandmother and her sister, whom he described as diligent and refined, as well as their parents, whom he characterized as a lovely couple, while noting that she was always kind when he visited, making good things happen, he said, whenever he did so. This little snippet about them proved to be more precious to me than I ever could have imagined. Wouldn't you like to know that your great-great-grandmother was someone who a small boy thought made wonderful things happen in his life when he was in her company? Wouldn't you like to think that some people think that about you? That somewhere, right at this moment perhaps, or perhaps next week or last week, someone has written down something about you that was a note of appreciation, of gratitude, of thanksgiving for something you did or said or thought or felt. This newspaper article reminded me of a passage from the novel Angels of the Universe, in which Einar Már Guðmundsson wrote, "I am of course well aware of the common theory that it is impossible to tell the story of one's life without including one's grandmothers, and preferably great-grandmothers too. Thus, it is not uncommon for people to write their biographies in many volumes and not be born themselves until the second or the third. I would prefer to say that no one should write their biography until their life is over," he concluded. But I don't really agree with that last part. I think the time to write your biography, to write down the story of the most important things that have happened to you, the most significant people you have encountered, the real milestones of your life, I think the time to do that is now, when you get home after the coffee hour. Each of us is responsible for curating the stories of our own life. So ideally, I think it's desirable for us to record our life stories as we go, or at least pause from time to time in order to reflect upon where we are and what brought us to that point. We might do so in a poem or journal entry, a letter or an email, or even in a conversation with a friend. If you follow me on Facebook, you'll know that my timeline is pretty much my own autobiography, for better or for worse. And I like to think I only occasionally have something to recant. Although my own political party felt different about something I had once written there. Several years ago, I was asked by Gerald Brown, the former librarian for the Winnipeg School Division, to come to Lyons Place and lead a workshop for people who were interested in writing the stories of their life. I showed up and encountered a rather skeptical group of people in many ways. It was interesting that the room was full, but it was also interesting that most of the people couldn't imagine why anyone would care about what they wrote about themselves. A curious paradox, it seems to me. But there they were, there we were together. And I encouraged them with just a few pieces of what I thought might be wisdom, or at least prompts to get underway. I reassured them that their grandchildren and their nieces and their nephews, even their neighbors, are interested in the story of their life. I assured them that the most interesting biographies of all are about people who lead so-called ordinary lives, not about the rich and famous, who are, if you stop to think about it for a moment, often really dull, except for their wealth and power. That when you look at whether they have a talent for something, you discover, well, they don't really, except for making money and exercising power. But they probably can't wire their own electrical. They probably can't paint a painting. A lot of them can't carry a tune. And few of them, it seems, have had the opportunity to work in their own gardens when they had gardeners to do it, or renovate their own homes when they had contractors to do it. Interesting people are those who do everyday things. And people actually hunger to know their stories. We are all responsible for curating the stories of our own life. And I suggested to people at that Lyons Place seminar that they just needed to start writing. You don't need to start at the beginning. You can start anywhere. Just write it down. This is actually something I learned from the American humorist Garrison Keillor, who said the best place to start writing is where the first word will hit the page, and then keep going from there. We'll always have time to edit what we commit to paper about our lives, although I can almost promise you, you will never get to it. But it doesn't matter. Others will edit for you by going through the story of your life and selecting the morsels that are most meaningful to them. I can only imagine that when she was barely past 20, Helen Keller must have wondered why anyone would be interested in her life. But she was encouraged to write it down. And the story of my life by Helen Keller has been one of the most influential books of the last century, and then some. School children read it. People seeking to understand their own lives read it. People struggling with their own adversity read it. It is a powerful story about everyday things told by a remarkable person, someone as remarkable as you. And so she began writing with a sense of fear and dread, as most people do when they're committing themselves to paper, rather than writing a note about someone else or writing down a fact in a journal. When we're committing ourselves to paper, fear is inevitably involved. And we may be a little superstitious in our hesitation about lifting the veil that clings to our lives. We may be a little fuzzy about some of the details. But surprisingly, I find that when I write something, I often discover what I believe when I thought I knew what I believed erroneously. I remember things more clearly, and I leave a legacy, a paper trail, a permanent record which your principal probably warned you about in grade school, that I hope one day might delight others, while in the meantime, doing so helps me understand myself. So what's the story of your life? Or are you going to trust me to reveal it when the time comes? What's the story of your life? What are those strong impressions and milestones that you would like to be remembered for, that you think are important to convey to others? What has animated you? What do you love? What makes you forget that time is even passing? What makes you sometimes forget that anyone is even near you? What do you wish to be remembered for? As it turns out, it's not the kind of things usually that we put on a resume, but rather qualities that are harder to put a finger on, qualities about the kind of people we are. The thought that someone once found us kind and that we maybe made magic happen for them when they visited. In the end, each of us curates our own stories. So what's the story of your life? Our closing hymn is number 128, For All That Is Our Life.